Hello everyone, I am Kate, and from now on, I will be the new narrator of this channel. If you enjoy this voice, rather than the one before, please let me know in the comments section. Make sure to subscribe and prepare for tonight's stories. I ordered the new iPhone 20 of the deep web. It's real, and I can see the future. So, I've always been one of those guys who's a little too curious for his own good. You know the type. Always poking around in places I probably shouldn't, just to see what's out there. It started out harmless, really. I was just browsing some tech forums, looking for a good deal on a new phone. My old one was a piece of junk, and I was getting tired of it lagging every time I tried to do anything remotely useful. That's when I stumbled across this post. It was buried deep in a thread about upcoming tech releases, and it mentioned something about the iPhone 20. I know, it sounds ridiculous, right? But the post was from some random user with a string of numbers for a name, and it claimed they had access to an early prototype of the iPhone 20. They said it wasn't just any prototype either. This one was special. The guy was adamant that it could do things no other phone could do, like some real next-level stuff that Apple wasn't even close to releasing. I know what you're thinking. Scam. And yeah, that's what I thought too. But there was something about the way the post was written. It didn't sound like your typical scammer BS. The guy didn't ask for money up front or anything like that. He just dropped a link to a site on the deep web and said if anyone was interested, they could check it out for themselves. I probably should have stopped there. I mean, deep web? That's like the digital version of the dark alleyways your parents tell you to avoid when you're a kid. But, like I said, curiosity gets the better of me sometimes. So, I did a little digging. I've messed around with the deep web a few times before. Nothing too serious. Just enough to know how to access it without getting into trouble. Or at least, that's what I thought. I fired up Tor, typed in the link, and hit enter. The site took a while to load, which wasn't surprising. What did surprise me was how simple it was. No flashy graphics, no annoying pop-ups. Just a plain black background with white text in the middle of the screen. It said, iPhone 20 prototype. Limited availability. $500. Instructions below. The instructions were straightforward. Send $500 worth of Bitcoin to a specific wallet address, then fill out a form with your shipping details. That was it. Now, I'm not an idiot. I knew this was probably a scam, but something about it felt different. I don't know how to explain it, but it was like this weird gut feeling that I couldn't shake. The kind that gnaws at you until you do something about it. So, against my better judgment, I went ahead and bought $500 worth of Bitcoin. The whole time, my brain was screaming at me to stop, but my fingers kept moving, transferring the money, filling out the form, hitting submit. Once it was done, the site refreshed with a single line of text. Order received. Delivery in 3 to 5 days. That was it. No confirmation email, no tracking number, nothing. Just that one line of text. I sat there staring at the screen, feeling like the biggest idiot on the planet. But what was done was done. I closed the browser, shut off my computer, and tried to forget about the whole thing. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been royally screwed. I kept checking my email, half expecting some spammy confirmation to show up, but there was nothing. After the 5th day came and went, I figured that was it. Lesson learned. I was out $500, and I had nothing to show for it. I chalked it up as a loss and decided not to mention it to anyone. I mean, who would I even tell? Hey guys, guess what dumb thing I did this week? Then, on the 7th day, a full week later, I came home to find a small package sitting on my doorstep. It didn't have any markings, no shipping label, nothing. Just a plain brown box about the size of a book. My heart skipped a beat. No way. There was no way this was actually happening. I grabbed the box and rushed inside, ripping it open as soon as I got through the door. Inside was a sleek black case, and in that case was, well, it looked like a phone. But it wasn't any iPhone I'd ever seen. The thing was almost too thin to be real, and it had this weird matte finish that seemed to absorb light. There was no Apple logo, just a single button on the front, and the edges were smooth and curved, almost organic. I pressed the button, half expecting nothing to happen, but the screen lit up instantly. No loading screen, no Apple logo, just straight to the home screen. It was eerily familiar, yet completely alien at the same time. The icons were similar to the ones on my old iPhone, but they had a strange, almost holographic quality to them, like they were floating just above the surface of the screen. There was only one app already installed on the phone. It was just a black square, with no name or label, sitting in the center of the screen. My finger hovered over it for a second, my stomach churning with that same weird feeling from before. I knew I should just shut the phone off and throw it away. But of course, I didn't. I tapped the app. And that's when things started to get really strange. When I tapped the app, the screen went completely black for a moment, and I thought the phone had crashed. But then, slowly, a single line of text appeared in the center of the screen. Future sight activated. Please select a date. Beneath the text was a calendar interface, and I felt my stomach drop. The app wasn't asking me to pick a day in the past. It was asking me to choose a date in the future. It didn't specify how far ahead I could go, but my finger automatically started scrolling forward, month by month. Something about the way the screen moved was mesmerizing. It was so smooth, almost as if the screen wasn't displaying the date, but the actual passage of time itself. I finally stopped on a random date, about a month from now, and selected it. The screen flashed, and suddenly I was looking at my bedroom. The image on the screen was crystal clear, like a live video feed, but there was something off. The lighting was different, like it was coming from a lamp I didn't recognize. My bed was in the same spot, but the comforter was a different color, one I didn't own. The weirdest part? I wasn't in the room. The place was completely empty. My heart was pounding as I scanned the room on the screen, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It felt like I was watching a CCTV feed of my future bedroom. I reached out to touch the screen, and it reacted instantly, zooming in on whatever I tapped on. I could even rotate the view, as if the camera was floating in the room. I checked the time on my current phone. It was still synced up to real time. But the screen was showing my bedroom a month from now. I don't know how long I sat there staring at the screen, but eventually, the image started to flicker, like an old TV with bad reception. The phone buzzed in my hand, and I looked down to see a new line of text. Live event detected. Do you wish to observe? My hand was trembling, but I couldn't help myself. I tapped yes, and the image shifted. It was still my room, but now There was something moving in the corner of the screen, near the window. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I watched the curtains sway slightly, even though the window was shut. Slowly, the door to my room creaked open, and a shadow moved into view. The figure was tall, with long, gaunt limbs that seemed to stretch out unnaturally. Its face was hidden in the darkness, but I could just make out the glint of eyes. Cold, empty eyes that seemed to be staring directly at me through the screen. It moved slowly, deliberately, like it knew exactly where it was going. My breath caught in my throat as it reached out one of those impossibly long arms and gently brushed the surface of my nightstand, knocking over a small trinket I kept there. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The trinket, the one that had just fallen over in the video, wasn't on my nightstand. I looked over to where it should have been, but it was gone. The room on the screen was becoming more and more like my own with every passing second. And then the figure stopped. It was standing in front of my bed, its head tilted as if listening to something I couldn't hear. Slowly, it turned and faced the door. My heart was hammering so hard, I thought it would burst out of my chest. The figure moved toward the door, and I swear I could hear the faintest creak of floorboards, as if it were right there with me. Suddenly, the screen went black, and a message popped up. Session ended. Thank you for using Future Sight. I was left staring at my reflection in the dark screen, my face pale and sweat dripping down my temples. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever I had just seen wasn't just some pre-programmed simulation. It felt real, like I had just glimpsed something I wasn't supposed to see. I tried to convince myself it was all some elaborate trick, maybe some kind of augmented reality gimmick. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. The phone, the app, that shadowy figure, it was all too real. For the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. Every time I walked into my room, I found myself glancing at the nightstand, expecting that trinket to be gone, or the curtains to start moving on their own. I even considered throwing the phone away, but some twisted part of me couldn't bring myself to do it. It was like the phone had some kind of hold on me. I began using the app more frequently, testing it out with different dates, but I never went too far into the future. I wanted to stay close enough to my own time so that I could make sense of what I was seeing. Each time, the app would show me a scene from my life, a conversation with a friend, a trip to the grocery store, even just me watching TV, but the shadowy figure never appeared again. At least, not until I made a mistake. One night, I had a few too many drinks and decided to mess around with the phone again. I scrolled further into the future than I ever had before. Years, maybe even decades. When I finally stopped, the app showed me a version of my house that I didn't recognize. The furniture was different. The walls were painted a strange shade of blue, and everything had this cold, sterile feeling to it. But that wasn't the worst part. In the middle of the living room, there was a large blackened stain on the floor, like something had been burned there. The furniture around it was gone, and the room looked like it had been abandoned for a long time. I zoomed in on the stain, and as I did, the phone began to vibrate violently in my hand. The screen flickered and distorted, and I could barely make out the text that appeared. Live event detected. Do you wish to observe? My head was spinning, but I tapped yes anyway. The screen cleared, and what I saw next will haunt me forever. A body, my body, was lying in the center of that blackened stain, twisted and contorted in ways that didn't seem possible. The skin was charred and cracked, and the eyes were still open, staring straight at the ceiling. And just beyond the edge of the frame, I could see the shadowy figure, standing perfectly still, watching. The phone slipped from my hand, clattering to the floor as the screen went dark. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. All I could do was sit there, staring at the spot where the phone had fallen. The image of my future self burned into my mind. I knew then that this wasn't just some high-tech toy or a glimpse into some possible future. The phone was showing me something that was going to happen, something that I had no way of stopping. But the worst part? I realized that by using the app, I had somehow called that shadowy figure into my life, and now it was only a matter of time before it came for me. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that horrific image of my body, lying in that charred spot on the floor, twisted in ways that defied logic. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it all, but nothing added up. How could a phone, a piece of technology, show me something so real, so terrifying? And that shadowy figure, what the hell was it? The days that followed were a blur. I was jumpy, paranoid, constantly looking over my shoulder. Every creak of the house, every flicker of light, sent my heart racing. I stopped using the phone entirely, too scared to even touch it. I shoved it in a drawer and tried to pretend it didn't exist, but the feeling of dread hung over me like a storm cloud. I started noticing little things around the house, things that were out of place. The curtains in my bedroom would be slightly open, even though I knew I'd closed them. My belongings would shift positions, just enough for me to notice, but not enough to convince anyone else that something was wrong. I was beginning to lose my grip, and deep down, I knew it was because of that damned phone. One evening, I was sitting in my living room, trying to distract myself with some mindless TV when I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible knock at the door. It was so quiet that at first, I thought I'd imagined it. But then it came again, a little louder this time. My skin prickled with a sudden wave of fear. Who the hell would be knocking on my door at this hour? I got up slowly, my body tense, every instinct screaming at me not to open it. But curiosity, always my downfall, got the better of me. I approached the door, hesitated for a moment, then looked through the peephole. There was no one there. I sighed in relief, but something still didn't feel right. I opened the door a crack and peered outside, half expecting to see the shadowy figure standing there. But there was nothing. Just the empty street, bathed in the dim glow of the streetlights. As I started to close the door, I noticed something on the ground just outside the threshold. It was a small, black object, about the size of a quarter. I bent down to pick it up, and as soon as my fingers touched it, a shiver ran through me. It was the trinket from my nightstand, the one that had fallen over in the future vision I'd seen on the phone. But here it was, outside my door, with no possible explanation for how it had gotten there. I stumbled back inside, slamming the door behind me, my mind reeling. The trinket felt ice cold in my hand, and I could feel a strange, pulsing energy emanating from it, like it was alive. I wanted to throw it across the room, but I couldn't bring myself to let it go. Instead, I shoved it into my pocket and paced the room, trying to calm my racing thoughts. That's when I heard the creaking. Soft, deliberate, like someone was slowly moving through the house. My blood ran cold. I stood perfectly still, straining to hear any other sounds, but the house was deathly quiet. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shadow slipping past the doorway to the living room, barely there, like a wisp of smoke. My heart jumped into my throat. I wasn't alone. I grabbed the closest thing I could find, a heavy book, and held it up like a makeshift weapon, my hands shaking uncontrollably. Slowly, I moved toward the hallway where I'd seen the shadow, every step feeling like I was walking through quicksand. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from a small nightlight I kept plugged in near the bathroom. I inched forward, my breath shallow, listening for any sign of movement. But the shadow was gone. I checked every room in the house, flipping on lights, searching for any trace of an intruder. But there was nothing. Everything was exactly as I'd left it. The only thing out of place was my own sense of reality, which was crumbling around me faster than I could keep up. I retreated to my bedroom, my nerves shot, and collapsed onto the bed, burying my face in my hands. I had to do something. I couldn't keep living like this, jumping at every sound, every flicker of movement. I needed answers, and the only place I could think to start was with that cursed phone. With trembling hands, I retrieved it from the drawer and powered it on. The screen lit up, that same strange home screen greeting me. The app, the one labeled Future Sight, was still there, taunting me with its presence. I hesitated for a long time before tapping on it again, my heart in my throat. The app opened, and once again, the black screen with white text appeared. Future Sight activated. Please select a date. I swallowed hard and forced myself to scroll to a date, only a day or two in the future. I needed to know if this was something I could prevent, or if it was already too late. I selected the date and waited, my palms sweating. The screen flickered, and I was back in my living room, the same one I was sitting in at that very moment. But this time, there was something different. A faint shape, moving in the shadows near the edge of the screen. My breath caught in my throat as the figure slowly came into focus. It was the shadowy figure, but it was closer now, almost at the center of the room. And then, I heard a noise. It wasn't coming from the phone. It was coming from behind me. I spun around, the phone slipping from my grasp, and saw a flicker of movement in the corner of the room near the doorway. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized that the figure on the screen wasn't just an image of some distant future. It was here, now, in my house, and it was getting closer. I backed away, my mind screaming at me to run, to get out of the house, but my body wouldn't respond. I was frozen in place, staring into the shadows, waiting for the inevitable. That's when I felt it. A cold breath on the back of my neck, like someone was standing right behind me. I spun around, swinging the book wildly, but there was nothing there. Nothing I could see, at least. The room grew colder, the shadows deeper, and I could feel something watching me, waiting. It was playing with me, drawing out the fear like it was feeding off of it. My skin prickled as the air around me seemed to vibrate, and I realized with a sickening dread that I wasn't going to escape this. Whatever the phone had shown me, whatever I had seen, it was already too late. I was trapped. The phone buzzed on the floor, and I forced myself to pick it up. The screen showed a single message, the letters sharp and clear against the black background. You have seen your future. There is no escape. I dropped the phone, my heart pounding in my ears, and ran out of the room, out of the house, into the cold night air. But as I reached the street, I realized something horrifying. No matter how far I ran, no matter where I went, that shadow, that thing, was always just a step behind me, and it was never going to let me go. I didn't stop running until I was halfway across town, panting, my lungs burning from the cold night air. My legs felt like they could give out at any moment, but the adrenaline pumping through me kept me going. I wasn't even sure where I was heading, just away from my house, away from that thing that had been lurking in the shadows. Finally, I found myself standing in front of an all-night diner, its neon sign flickering in the darkness, like a beacon of normalcy in the nightmare my life had become. I staggered inside, the bell over the door jangling as I crossed the threshold. The place was nearly empty, just a tired-looking waitress behind the counter and a couple of truckers nursing cups of coffee in the corner booth. They glanced up at me for a moment, then went back to their conversations, oblivious to the terror that was gnawing at my insides. I slid into a booth near the back, my hands trembling as I tried to collect myself. The warmth of the diner was a stark contrast to the icy fear that had settled into my bones. I kept glancing at the door, half expecting to see that shadowy figure slip inside, but nothing came. For the moment, at least, I was alone. The waitress came over and asked if I wanted coffee. I nodded, my voice too shaky to form words. She didn't seem to notice my state, or if she did, she didn't care. I watched her pour the coffee, her movements slow and methodical, like she was moving through molasses. Everything felt surreal, like I was stuck in a dream I couldn't wake up from. As I stared into the black liquid, my mind raced through everything that had happened. The phone, the Future Sight app, that shadowy figure. It was all connected, but I couldn't piece together how or why. All I knew was that I had unleashed something into my life, something I couldn't control, something I couldn't escape. I took a sip of the coffee, the bitter taste snapping me back to the present. I needed to think, to figure out what my next move was. But every time I tried to focus, that image of my future self, charred and broken, kept flashing in my mind, making it impossible to concentrate. The bell above the door jingled again, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. But it was just another late-night customer, a guy in a hooded jacket who shuffled in and sat at the counter. I let out a shaky breath and forced myself to calm down. Paranoia was creeping in, making everything seem like a threat. I needed help, but who could I possibly turn to? My friends would think I'd lost it if I told them about any of this. The police? Yeah, right. Excuse me, officer. There's a shadow monster stalking me because of a phone I bought off the deep web. They'd lock me up for sure. That left me with one option, the phone itself. As much as I hated the thought of using it again, it was the only link I had to whatever was happening. Maybe there was a way to undo this, to reverse whatever curse or whatever the hell it was that had latched onto me. I took out the phone, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped it. The screen lit up as soon as I touched it, that familiar cold glow that had become so unsettling. The Future Sight app was still there, front and center, like it was waiting for me. I hesitated for a long moment, my finger hovering over the icon. Then I steeled myself and tapped it. The now familiar black screen with white text appeared. Future Sight activated. Please select a date. I was tempted to scroll forward, to see if there was any hope beyond that vision of my own death. But something told me that was a bad idea. Instead, I tried scrolling backward, to a date before all of this started. but the app wouldn't let me. It was like I was trapped in a forward-moving timeline with no way to go back. Frustration boiled inside me. I needed answers, and this app was the only thing that might provide them. I scrolled to the nearest future date, just a few hours from now, and selected it. The screen flickered, and I was once again looking at my own house. But something was different this time. The place was lit up with what looked like flashing red and blue lights. Police lights. The scene shifted, and I could see figures moving around inside my house. It was hard to make out exactly what was happening, but it looked like the police were searching my place, going through every room, every drawer. Then, the image focused on something outside the house. An ambulance. The back doors were open, and 2 paramedics were loading a stretcher inside. My heart skipped a beat when I saw what was on the stretcher. It was me. But I wasn't dead, at least not yet. I was unconscious, my face pale and drawn, my body strapped down, like they were worried I might wake up and start thrashing around. I watched as they closed the doors and drove off, the police still swarming around my house. The screen went black again, and a new message appeared. Event in progress. Do you wish to continue? I stared at the message, my mind racing. This was different from anything I'd seen before. There was no shadowy figure, no sign of that charred future self, just a glimpse of what was about to happen. I hesitated, then tapped yes. The screen flashed, and suddenly I was seeing through my own eyes. But it wasn't the present. It was me, hours from now, lying on that stretcher, groggy and disoriented. The paramedics were talking, their voices muffled, but I could catch snippets of their conversation. Found him outside, incoherent, possibly in shock. House was ransacked, nothing taken, just destroyed. Weird marks on the walls, like burns or something. My head was swimming, both in the vision and in reality. I tried to focus on what they were saying, to make sense of it, but everything was hazy, distorted. I could feel the pressure in my chest, a suffocating weight that made it hard to breathe. Then, as the ambulance sped down the dark road, I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of that shadowy figure, keeping pace with the ambulance, its hollow eyes fixed on me. The screen went black again, and I was back in the diner, the phone buzzing softly in my hand. I sat there, numb, trying to process what I'd just seen. The police were going to find me, but it wouldn't matter. That thing, it was still coming for me, and it wasn't going to stop until it had me. I couldn't stay here. I had to move, keep ahead of it somehow. But where could I go? It wasn't like I could outrun this thing. It was everywhere, slipping through the cracks of reality, always just a step behind. I paid for my untouched coffee and stumbled out of the diner, the cold night air hitting me like a slap in the face. My mind was racing, my body moving on autopilot as I walked aimlessly through the deserted streets. I kept checking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that figure lurking in the shadows. But the streets were empty. Eventually, I found myself at the edge of town, near the old industrial district. The factories had been shut down for years, the buildings left to rot and decay. It was a place no one ever went, a forgotten corner of the world. Maybe, just maybe, it would be enough to hide from whatever was after me. I slipped through a gap in the chain-link fence and made my way into one of the abandoned warehouses. The place was a mess. Broken windows, rusted machinery, graffiti-covered walls. But it was quiet. I found a corner to huddle in, my back against the wall, the phone clutched in my hand like a lifeline. For the first time in what felt like hours, I allowed myself to breathe. Maybe this would be enough. Maybe I could wait it out here, figure out a plan, find a way to break free from whatever curse this phone had brought down on me. But as I sat there, in the silence of that dark, forgotten place, I felt it, a presence, cold and malevolent, slowly closing in. The shadows around me seemed to grow darker, deeper, and I knew, with a sickening certainty, that I wasn't alone. The phone buzzed in my hand, the screen lighting up with one final message. The future is inevitable. There is no escape. And then, the shadows moved. The darkness in the warehouse felt like it was alive, wrapping around me like a shroud. My breath was shallow, each inhale feeling like I was trying to pull air through a straw. The phone in my hand buzzed again, but this time I didn't look at it. I was too afraid of what I might see, too afraid that if I looked away from the shadows for even a second, that thing would take me. But I couldn't just sit there, waiting for the inevitable. My survival instincts kicked in, telling me to move, to run, to do anything but stay in that corner. I forced myself to stand, my legs shaking beneath me. The warehouse was a maze of rusted metal and broken glass, but I didn't care. I just needed to put as much distance between myself and that presence as possible. I bolted for the nearest exit, a door hanging crooked on its hinges. My footsteps echoed in the cavernous space, the sound bouncing off the walls and making it impossible to tell where the thing was. Every shadow seemed to twist and stretch as I ran, as if they were reaching out to pull me in. I burst through the door into the cold night, the air hitting me like a slap to the face. For a moment, I felt a surge of hope. Maybe I'd outrun it. Maybe I could escape. But that hope died the second I saw what was waiting for me outside. The shadowy figure was there, standing in the middle of the desolate street, its form more defined now, more solid. Its eyes, those empty black pits, seemed to bore into me, freezing me in place. It didn't move, didn't need to. It knew I had nowhere left to run. The phone buzzed again, more insistent this time, almost as if it were trying to get my attention. With trembling hands, I finally looked down at the screen. The app had opened on its own, showing me one last image, a vision of myself, standing right where I was now, in that empty street. But there was something different about this future version of me. In the vision, I was holding the phone up to my ear, listening to something. My face was pale, drawn tight with fear, and my eyes were wide with realization, like I was hearing something that had finally made everything clear. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the screen. What was I hearing? What was the phone trying to tell me? The fear was overwhelming, but so was the curiosity. Despite everything, despite the terror that gripped me, I found myself mimicking the future version of myself. I raised the phone to my ear. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, heavy, oppressive, like the air itself was holding its breath. Then, I heard it, a voice, soft and whispery, like the rustle of dead leaves. It was hard to make out, but I could just barely understand the words. You cannot escape what you have summoned. The future you saw is your fate. Accept it, and the suffering will end. The voice was calm, almost soothing, but the words sent a chill down my spine. Accept it? Accept that I was going to die, that I was going to end up like that charred corpse in my vision? No, There had to be another way. There had to be something I could do. I pulled the phone away from my ear, my mind racing. I could see the shadowy figure still standing there, watching, waiting. It wasn't moving because it didn't need to. It knew that the future was already set in stone, that I was trapped in this timeline, unable to break free, but maybe I could change it. The thought struck me like a bolt of lightning. The phone had shown me the future, but it hadn't shown me how I got there. What if I could do something now? Something to alter the course I was on? What if that vision wasn't set in stone, but just one possible outcome? I looked down at the phone, scrolling through the dates with a new sense of urgency. If there was even a chance that I could change what was coming, I had to try. I didn't know how far forward I needed to go, but I kept scrolling until I reached a date that was months into the future. I selected it and waited, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The screen flickered, and then I was looking at a scene that was both familiar and alien. A house, not mine, but one that I felt I should recognize. It was night, and the windows were dark, save for a single light glowing in the upstairs window. My pulse quickened as the image zoomed in on the window, showing me the inside of a room. It was a bedroom, simple and plain, with a bed, a dresser, and a single figure sitting on the edge of the bed. It was me. But this version of me looked different. Older, maybe, or just worn down. There was no fear on my face, only a kind of resigned acceptance, like I had made peace with whatever was coming. The phone in my hand buzzed, and I watched as the future me looked down at my own phone, seeing the same vision I was seeing now. The figure in the vision stood up, walked to the window, and stared out into the night. And then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, I could see something in the darkness outside the window. A shadow, moving closer, its form indistinct, but unmistakable. The future me didn't react, didn't even flinch. Instead, I simply turned away from the window, set the phone down on the dresser, and walked out of the room, leaving the shadow to fill the space where I had been. The screen went black, the vision ending as abruptly as it had begun. I was left standing in the middle of the empty street, my mind spinning. The future was inevitable, the voice had said, but it didn't have to be like that. If I could face whatever was coming, if I could accept it, maybe, just maybe, I could change the ending. The shadowy figure began to move, slowly, deliberately, closing the distance between us. I could feel the cold seeping into my bones, the darkness wrapping around me like a cloak. But this time, I didn't run. I didn't try to escape. I took a deep breath, the cold air burning my lungs, and lowered the phone from my ear. The figure was almost upon me now, its hollow eyes locked onto mine. I could feel its presence, suffocating, consuming, but I stood my ground. The future was inevitable, yes, but not unchangeable. And as the darkness closed in, as the shadow reached out to claim me, I made a decision. I wasn't going to run anymore. I wasn't going to hide. Whatever happened next, whatever came for me, I would face it head on. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. The world around me seemed to slow, the shadows drawing closer, the cold intensifying. But in that final moment, as the darkness swallowed me whole, I felt a strange sense of peace. The future was still unwritten. And in that fleeting instant, I knew I had the power to change it. The phone slipped from my hand, clattering to the ground as the shadows finally consumed me. And then, there was nothing but darkness. I wanted to save my mother by ordering a doctor of the deep web. You won't believe what happened next. My mom was always my rock. She was the kind of person who would drop everything just to help someone in need. But about a year ago, things started to change. At first, it was little things, forgetting where she put her keys, mixing up names. But then, it got worse, much worse. She started having these episodes where she'd just stare blankly at nothing, her eyes empty like she was seeing something that wasn't there. I tried to talk to her about it, but she always brushed it off, saying she was just tired or stressed. But deep down, I knew something was seriously wrong. I tried to get her to see a doctor, but she was stubborn, said she didn't need some quack poking around in her head. Then, one night, I found her in the kitchen, just standing there with a knife in her hand, not doing anything, just holding it. When I asked her what she was doing, she snapped out of it and looked at me like I was the crazy one. I was just going to make a sandwich, she said, but there was no bread, no food out, nothing that indicated she was making anything. I was terrified, but I didn't know what to do. So, I started researching, trying to figure out what could be wrong with her. I spent hours online, reading through medical forums, articles, anything that could give me a clue. But nothing I found matched her symptoms exactly, and the more I searched, the more desperate I became. Then, one sleepless night, I stumbled across something different. I was deep into some forum, one of those places you shouldn't be at 3 a.m., and I found a thread about alternative medicine. Most of it was the usual nonsense, herbal remedies, detoxes, stuff like that. But one comment caught my eye. It was a single sentence, buried in a sea of quackery. If you're out of options, try the deep web. At first, I ignored it. I mean, everyone's heard the horror stories about the deep web. Drugs, hitmen, all that crazy stuff. But as days went by and Mom got worse, that comment kept nagging at me. What if there was something, someone, out there who could help her? What if this was my only shot? So I did the unthinkable. I started researching how to access the deep web. It wasn't as hard as I thought it would be. A few downloads, a few clicks, and there I was, on the hidden side of the internet. It was like stepping into another world, one where nothing was off limits. At first, I was just exploring, getting a feel for things. It was mostly what I expected. Forums, marketplaces, all kinds of illegal stuff. But then, I found a section dedicated to medical services. Most of it was black market organ sales and fake prescriptions. But there was one listing that stood out. Specialist doctor services. Guaranteed results for the desperate and hopeless. It was a plain text ad. No flashy graphics or anything. But something about it just felt different. The post claimed the doctor could treat conditions that mainstream medicine couldn't or wouldn't touch. It didn't say exactly what those conditions were, but it did mention memory loss, personality changes, and unusual behavior. It was like they were describing my mom. There was no price listed, just a request to email them with the subject line, "Consultation Request," and a brief description of the problem. I hesitated for a long time. I knew this was a bad idea. Everything about it screamed bad idea, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this might be my only chance to help her. And the longer I waited, the worse she got. So, I did it. I sent the email. I didn't expect a response, at least not right away. But within an hour, I got a reply. It was short, just a few lines. Your request has been received. Prepare a quiet, private place. Do not be disturbed. Our doctor will contact you shortly." There was no name, no way to reply, just those instructions. I remember sitting there, staring at the screen, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew I should delete the email, shut down my computer, and forget this whole thing. But I couldn't. I had already gone too far. So, I did as they asked. I prepared the guest room, making sure it was clean and quiet. I didn't tell my mom anything. I just told her to go to bed early that night. Around midnight, the doorbell rang. My heart nearly jumped out of my chest when the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. I hadn't told a soul about what I'd done. Who could possibly be at my door at this hour? I crept down the hallway, each step feeling like it took a lifetime. When I reached the front door, I hesitated, staring at the handle. Everything in me screamed not to open it, but I had to. I had to know who, or what, was on the other side. I slowly turned the handle and pulled the door open just a crack. The figure standing on my porch was not what I expected. He was tall, his face obscured by the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat. He wore a long, dark coat that looked like it had seen better days, and in his gloved hand, he held a small black bag, like the kind old-fashioned doctors used to carry. His presence was unsettling, but there was something oddly professional about him, like he was here on business. "Are you the one who sent the request?" His voice was low, almost a whisper, but there was a strange authority to it that made me nod before I even realized what I was doing. "Yes," I stammered. "It's my mother. She's sick, and I—" He raised a hand to stop me, and I immediately fell silent. Without another word, he stepped inside, moving past me like he already knew the layout of my house. I shut the door, my mind racing. This was happening. This was real. But as he walked down the hallway towards the guest room, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just let something dark and wrong into my home. The stranger stopped at the door to the guest room and turned to me. "Is she ready?" I nodded, though I wasn't entirely sure what ready meant. I'd convinced my mom to go to bed early, but she was still awake, probably watching one of those late-night infomercials she loved. I led him to her room, the silence between us growing heavier with each step. When we reached her door, I knocked softly. "Mom? There's someone here to see you." My voice trembled, the words feeling strange in my mouth. There was a pause, and then she answered, her voice thin and tired. "Who is it?" "It's a doctor. I think he can help." Another pause, longer this time. Finally, she said, "All right, bring him in." I pushed the door open, and we both stepped inside. The room was dim, lit only by the flickering light of the TV. My mom was sitting up in bed, her face pale and drawn, the remote clutched tightly in her hand. She looked at the man with a mix of confusion and curiosity, but there was no fear in her eyes. If anything, she seemed relieved that I had finally brought someone to help her. The man took a step forward and set his bag on the bedside table. He turned to her, his movements slow and deliberate. "Mrs. Harlow," he began, his voice soft but firm, "I'm here to help you, but you must trust me completely. Do you understand?" She nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving his. The room felt colder somehow, like the temperature had dropped the moment he entered. I hovered by the door, feeling more like a spectator than her son, watching as this strange man took control of the situation. He opened his bag and pulled out a small vial filled with a dark liquid and a syringe. My stomach churned at the sight, but my mom didn't flinch. She just watched him, her expression calm, almost serene. He filled the syringe with the liquid and turned to me. "I need you to leave the room now." It wasn't a request. It was an order. I hesitated, but the look in his eyes made it clear that I wasn't welcome there anymore. I nodded and backed out of the room, pulling the door shut behind me. As soon as I was in the hallway, I pressed my ear to the door, trying to hear what was happening inside. But there was nothing. Just silence. The minutes dragged by, each one feeling like an eternity. I wanted to barge in, to demand to know what he was doing to her, but I couldn't. Something kept me rooted in place, a deep, primal fear that I couldn't explain. So, I waited, my heart pounding in my chest, until finally, the door creaked open. The man stepped out, his face unreadable. He didn't say anything, just walked past me, heading straight for the front door. I followed him, too stunned to speak. When we reached the door, he paused and turned to me. "She's sleeping now. Let her rest. I'll return tomorrow night to complete the treatment." "Wait," I blurted out. "Is she going to be okay? What did you do to her?" He looked at me with those cold, dark eyes, and for a moment, I thought he wasn't going to answer. But then he said, "The process has begun. You'll see results soon enough." With that, he opened the door and stepped out into the night, disappearing into the shadows without another word. I stood there, staring after him, feeling a chill that went down to my bones. The house was too quiet, too still. I wanted to run after him, demand more answers, but my feet wouldn't move. All I could do was close the door and try to calm the rising panic in my chest. I went back to check on my mom, my hand trembling as I pushed open her door. She was lying in bed, her breathing slow and even, like she was in a deep, peaceful sleep. For the first time in months, she looked calm, but there was something off about it, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. I told myself it was just my nerves, that I was imagining things, but that uneasy feeling wouldn't go away. I backed out of the room and shut the door quietly, but as I turned to go back to my own room, I thought I heard something, a faint, almost inaudible whisper coming from behind her door. I froze, listening, but it was gone as quickly as it had come. I shook my head, trying to convince myself that it was nothing, just the house settling or the wind outside. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Something had changed in my mom's room that night, and whatever it was, I wasn't ready to face it. Not yet. So, I went to bed, hoping that when morning came, everything would be back to normal. But as I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just made the biggest mistake of my life. The next morning, I woke up feeling like I hadn't slept at all. The events of the previous night felt like a twisted dream. But when I got out of bed and saw the guest room door slightly ajar, I knew it had been real. My heart raced as I approached the door, my mind replaying the eerie silence that had followed the so-called doctor's visit. I wasn't sure what I was going to find on the other side, but I had to know. I slowly pushed the door open, bracing myself for I don't know what. But when I stepped inside, I found my mom sitting up in bed, looking more alert and rested than I'd seen her in months. She was watching TV, her eyes focused, her expression clear, almost too clear. "Morning, Mom," I said cautiously, trying to gauge her mood. She turned to look at me, and for a split second, I thought there was something strange about her eyes. They were the same deep brown as always, but there was a sharpness to them that I couldn't quite place. "Morning, honey," she replied, her voice steady and strong. "I feel much better today, like a fog has lifted." I wanted to feel relieved. I really did, but something about the way she said it sent a shiver down my spine. That's great," I said, forcing a smile. "Did you sleep well?" "Yes," she said, her gaze drifting back to the TV. "The best sleep I've had in years." There was something unsettling in her calmness, like she was too composed, too at ease. But I didn't want to push her, not after everything that had happened. Maybe this was just part of the treatment, I told myself. Maybe the doctor really was helping her, and I was just being paranoid. Throughout the day, I kept an eye on her, waiting for any sign that something was wrong. But she seemed fine, more than fine, actually. She moved around the house with a sense of purpose, cleaning, organizing, even humming to herself. It was almost like she was a different person, like the old version of her had come back overnight. But there were small things that didn't add up. She didn't seem interested in the things she used to love, her old hobbies, her favorite TV shows. Instead, she spent hours just sitting in the living room, staring out the window or flipping through channels without really watching anything. And when she spoke, there was a strange formality to her words, like she was choosing them carefully, deliberately. That evening, as we sat down to dinner, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I watched her closely, trying to find any clue that might explain the changes in her. And then I noticed it. Her hands. They were perfectly still. My mom had always been a little fidgety, always tapping her fingers on the table or twirling her hair absent-mindedly. But now, her hands rested on the table, completely motionless, like she was consciously controlling every movement. It was such a small thing, but it sent a chill down my spine. "Mom," I began, trying to keep my voice steady, "do you remember what happened last night? The doctor who came?" She looked up from her plate, her expression blank for a moment. Then she smiled, a slow, deliberate smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Of course. He was very kind. He said he'd be back tonight to check on me." The way she said it, like it was the most normal thing in the world, made my stomach turn. "Are you sure you're feeling okay?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She tilted her head slightly, studying me with those sharp, too clear eyes. "I'm fine, dear. Better than I've been in a long time. You don't need to worry about me." But I was worried. More than worried. I was terrified. Something had changed in her. Something subtle but deeply wrong. And I couldn't shake the feeling that it had something to do with that man. The doctor. The thought of him coming back tonight filled me with dread. But I didn't know what to do. I had invited him into our lives after all. I had opened that door. As the evening wore on, my anxiety only grew. I kept glancing at the clock, dreading the moment when the doorbell would ring again. My mom seemed oblivious, going about her evening routine with an eerie calmness. It was like she was preparing for something, though I couldn't tell what. Around 11 p.m., she announced that she was going to bed. "I need to be well rested for when the doctor arrives," she said, with that same unsettling smile. She kissed me on the cheek and headed down the hallway to her room, leaving me alone in the living room with my racing thoughts. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the door, waiting for the inevitable. My mind was a whirlwind of fear and doubt. What had I done? Who was that man? And what was he really doing to my mom? Finally, just after midnight, the doorbell rang. I froze. every muscle in my body tensing. It was the same as before. 3 slow, deliberate rings that echoed through the quiet house. I wanted to ignore it, to pretend I wasn't there, but I knew that wouldn't stop him. He had come back, just as he'd said he would. I forced myself to stand, my legs shaking as I walked towards the door. This time, I didn't hesitate. I opened it wide, and there he was, standing on the porch in the same dark coat and hat, his black bag in hand. "Good evening," he said, his voice calm and measured. "I trust everything is in order?" I nodded, unable to find my voice. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him with a soft click. I felt a wave of cold air sweep through the hallway, like the temperature had dropped the moment he entered. "Your mother is waiting, I assume?" he asked, though it wasn't really a question. "She's in her room," I managed to say, my throat tight with fear. He nodded and moved down the hallway with that same eerie confidence. I followed him, my heart pounding in my chest. When we reached my mom's room, he paused and turned to me. "I will need to work in private again," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. I wanted to refuse, to demand answers, but something in his eyes made it clear that wouldn't end well. So I nodded and stepped back, watching as he entered my mom's room and shut the door behind him. As soon as the door closed, I felt a wave of panic wash over me. I couldn't just stand there and do nothing. Not this time. I needed to know what was happening, what he was doing to her. My mom had been acting strange all day, too calm, too controlled, and I was convinced it had something to do with him. I waited a few minutes, just long enough for him to get started, and then I crept back down the hallway. I pressed my ear to the door, straining to hear anything. Voices, movement, anything that might give me a clue. But all I could hear was silence. That heavy, unnatural silence that had filled the house since he first arrived. Then, just as I was about to pull away, I heard something. A low, rhythmic humming, almost like a chant. It was coming from inside the room, soft but insistent, like a pulse. My blood ran cold as I realized it wasn't my mom's voice. It was his. I pressed closer, trying to make out the words, but they were too muffled, too distorted. The chanting grew louder, more intense, and I could hear my mom's voice now, too. But it wasn't the calm, clear voice from earlier. It was frantic, desperate, like she was arguing with him, pleading with him. I couldn't take it anymore. I reached for the doorknob, ready to burst in and stop whatever was happening. But the moment I touched it, the chanting stopped. The sudden silence was deafening, and for a split second, I thought I had imagined the whole thing. But then, the door slowly creaked open, and I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my throat. The doctor stood in the doorway, his face calm, almost serene. But there was something different about him this time, something darker, more menacing. "She's resting now," he said, his voice low and measured. "The treatment is progressing as expected." I tried to look past him, into the room, but he blocked my view. "What did you do to her?" I demanded, my voice trembling with fear. He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped forward, forcing me to back up. "You'll see the results soon enough," he said, his tone cold and final. Before I could say anything else, he brushed past me and walked down the hallway, heading for the front door. I followed him, my mind racing with questions, but I couldn't find the words. He opened the door and stepped outside, pausing just long enough to turn back to me. "I'll return tomorrow night," he said. "It will be the final visit. And with that, he was gone, disappearing into the shadows just like before. I stood there, staring after him, feeling a deep, gnawing fear settle in my gut. Whatever was happening to my mom, it was reaching its climax, and I wasn't sure if I could stop it, or if I even wanted to. I shut the door and leaned against it, my mind spinning. I needed answers, but I wasn't sure where to start. The only thing I knew for certain was that when the doctor returned tomorrow night, everything would change, one way or another. The hours between the doctor's visit and dawn dragged on like a nightmare that wouldn't end. I spent most of the night pacing the house, checking on my mom every few minutes. She was still asleep, but her breathing was shallow, and her skin had taken on an unhealthy, waxy pallor every time I looked at her. A sickening feeling of dread twisted in my gut. I knew something was terribly wrong, but I felt helpless, like I was watching a train wreck in slow motion. By the time morning finally came, I was exhausted, but the adrenaline kept me going. I couldn't sit still, couldn't focus on anything but the gnawing fear that tonight would be the end of whatever twisted process had begun. I needed answers, but I didn't know where to find them, or if I even wanted to. What could I do against something I didn't understand? Something that felt bigger and darker than anything I'd ever faced. I decided to go back to where this all started, the deep web. I knew it was a long shot, but maybe, just maybe, I could find something there that would help me figure out what was happening. Maybe there were others who had gone through this, others who had dealt with this doctor and survived to tell the tale. I powered up my computer, feeling a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck as I navigated through the layers of the deep web. It wasn't long before I found myself back in the same dark corner where I'd first found the doctor's services. But this time, I wasn't just browsing. I was desperate. I combed through forums, reading every thread that even remotely mentioned the doctor or his services. Most of it was the same vague, cryptic nonsense I'd seen before. People talking about miracles, unexplained recoveries, and cures that mainstream medicine couldn't achieve. But buried in the sea of praise and hope, I found something different. Something that made my blood run cold. It was a short post, just a few lines, but the words hit me like a punch to the gut. Don't trust him. The price is too high. My wife. She's not the same. She's not her anymore. I read the post over and over, my hands shaking. It was the only warning I found, but it confirmed my worst fears. Whatever this doctor was doing, it wasn't just healing. It was changing people, taking something from them that couldn't be replaced. I tried to reach out to the person who posted it, but there was no reply. It was like they had vanished after leaving that message, leaving me with nothing but a sense of impending doom. As the day wore on, I found myself in a state of numb terror. I didn't know what to do. Confront the doctor when he returned, try to stop him. But how? I was just one person, and he was something else entirely, something I couldn't fight with words or reason. I kept going back to my mom's room, hoping she would wake up, hoping she would be herself again. But every time I checked on her, she was still asleep, still pale and cold, like she was slipping away right in front of me. By evening, my fear had turned into a sick determination. I couldn't just stand by and let this happen. I had to do something, anything, to stop it. So I went to the kitchen and grabbed the biggest knife I could find, the cold metal heavy in my hand. It felt ridiculous, but it was the only weapon I had. I wasn't going to let him take my mom without a fight. As the sun set, the house grew darker, the shadows lengthening, stretching across the walls like creeping fingers. I sat in the living room, the knife clutched tightly in my hand, waiting. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside made my heart leap into my throat. I kept my eyes on the front door, knowing that when the time came, I had to be ready. Then, just after midnight, the doorbell rang. I nearly dropped the knife, my hands slick with sweat. The sound echoed through the house, each chime a reminder that the moment I'd been dreading had finally arrived. I stood up on shaky legs, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. There was no backing out now. I had to confront him, had to stop this madness before it was too late. I forced myself to walk to the door, each step feeling like I was marching to my own execution. When I reached it, I hesitated, the knife trembling in my grip. My mind screamed at me to run, to hide, to do anything but open that door. But I had no choice. I had to face whatever was on the other side. I flung the door open, and there he was, just as I expected. The same dark coat, the same wide-brimmed hat, the same cold, unreadable eyes. But this time, there was something different about him, something darker, more sinister. "Good evening," he said, his voice as calm and measured as ever. "I see you're prepared." I tightened my grip on the knife, trying to keep my voice steady. "What have you done to my mom?" He tilted his head slightly, like he was considering how much to tell me. "She's undergoing the final phase of treatment," he said slowly. "The results will be apparent soon. I want you to stop," I demanded, my voice trembling with fear and anger. "Whatever you're doing, just stop it. Leave her alone." He looked at me with those dark eyes, and I felt a chill run down my spine. "I'm afraid it's too late for that," he said softly. "The process is nearly complete. There's no turning back now." My stomach twisted in knots, a wave of nausea crashing over me. I couldn't let him do this. I raised the knife, pointing it at him, though my hands were shaking so badly I wasn't sure I could even use it. But the doctor didn't flinch. He didn't even seem surprised. Instead, he took a slow, deliberate step forward, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over me. "You don't understand what you've asked for," he said, his voice low and almost sympathetic. "The treatment is not without its consequences, but your mother will be free of her illness. That is what you wanted, isn't it?" I shook my head, tears welling up in my eyes. "Not like this. Not if it means losing her." His expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Pity, maybe. "There is always a price," he said quietly. "But I promise you, she will be well again. She will live." I opened my mouth to argue, to plead, but the words wouldn't come. Deep down, I knew he was telling the truth, at least part of it. My mom would be well, but she wouldn't be the same. I had traded her illness for something far worse, something I couldn't take back. The doctor took another step forward, closing the distance between us. "It's time," he said, reaching out a gloved hand. "Put down the knife. You don't want to hurt anyone." For a moment, I considered it. I considered dropping the knife, stepping aside, and letting him finish whatever twisted procedure he had started. But then I thought of my mom, the way she used to be, the way she smiled and laughed before all of this. I couldn't lose her, not like this. With a surge of desperation, I lunged at him, the knife aimed straight for his chest. But before I could strike, He moved faster than I thought possible, grabbing my wrist and twisting it until I cried out in pain. The knife clattered to the floor, and I fell to my knees, tears streaming down my face. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice cold and final. "But this is the only way." He let go of my wrist, and I collapsed onto the floor, clutching my arm in agony. The last thing I saw before he disappeared down the hallway towards my mom's room was the cold, empty look in his eyes, like he had already decided her fate. As I lay there, sobbing on the floor, I knew I had lost. The doctor was going to finish what he started, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. The last bit of hope I had left slipped away, leaving only a hollow, aching fear. I heard the door to my mom's room close, followed by that same eerie silence that had haunted me since the first night. And in that silence, I knew, whatever happened next, nothing would ever be the same. I don't know how long I lay there on the floor, the cold seeping into my bones. Time felt like it had stopped, leaving me in a void of fear and despair. My wrist throbbed where the doctor had twisted it, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the dread that gnawed at my insides. I knew I had lost. Whatever was happening in that room with my mom, I couldn't stop it. I had invited this nightmare into our lives, and now I had to face the consequences. Eventually, I forced myself to get up. My legs were shaky, my mind numb, but I couldn't just lie there, waiting for the inevitable. I had to see what he was doing, what he had done. Even if I couldn't change it, I had to know. I had to face it. I made my way down the hallway, every step feeling heavier than the last. The silence was suffocating, like the house itself was holding its breath. When I reached the door to my mom's room, I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. I was terrified of what I might find on the other side, but there was no turning back now. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and pushed the door open. The room was dark, save for a single dim lamp on the bedside table. The doctor was standing by the bed, his back to me, his black bag on the floor at his feet. My mom was lying in bed, her eyes closed, her breathing slow and steady. She looked peaceful, almost serene, but there was something unnatural about it, something that made my skin crawl. The doctor didn't turn around when I entered. He seemed to be focused on something, his hands moving slowly, methodically over my mom's body. I couldn't see exactly what he was doing, but I knew it wasn't right. I could feel it in the air, a wrongness that clung to the room like a heavy fog. What are you doing to her?" I managed to choke out, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't respond at first. He just continued his work, his movements precise and deliberate. But then, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke. "I'm finishing the treatment," he said, his voice calm, almost soothing. "It's nearly complete." I took a step closer, my heart pounding in my chest. "What do you mean? What's happening to her?" He finally turned to face me. And when he did, I saw something that made my blood run cold. His eyes, they weren't human. They were dark, empty voids, like looking into the abyss itself. And there was something else, something in his expression that told me he wasn't just a man. He was something other. The illness she suffered from was beyond the reach of conventional medicine, he said, his voice low and steady. It was something ancient, something that has been dormant for generations. But I have the knowledge to treat such things. I've cured her of the disease. But what's the cost?" I stammered, my mind reeling. You said there's always a price. What did you take from her?" He regarded me for a long moment, and I could feel the weight of his gaze, the coldness that seemed to seep into my very soul. "Her illness was not just of the body," he said slowly. "It was of the mind, the spirit. To cure her, I had to cleanse her completely. What she was before, the person you knew, that part of her is gone." "No." I shook my head, backing away. "No, that can't be true. She's still my mom. She has to be." He didn't argue, didn't try to convince me. He simply turned back to my mom, his hands moving again in that strange, deliberate way. "She is healed," he said softly. "But she is different now. She will live a long life, free of pain, free of disease. But the person you knew is no more." My legs gave out, and I sank to the floor, tears streaming down my face. This couldn't be happening. This had to be some kind of nightmare, a sick joke. But deep down, I knew it was true. I had asked for a miracle, and this was the price. I don't know how long I sat there, crying, broken, but eventually, I felt a hand on my shoulder. I looked up to see the doctor standing over me, his expression unreadable. "It's done," he said quietly. "She will wake soon, and she will be new. But you must understand, she won't remember you, not in the way you hope. The memories of her former life have been wiped clean, replaced with something else." I stared at him, my mind a whirl of grief and confusion. "What do you mean? What will she remember?" He hesitated, just for a moment, and in that hesitation, I saw something that almost resembled pity. "She will remember nothing of the pain, nothing of the illness. She will remember only peace, only calm. But she won't remember you as her son. You will be a stranger to her, a figure from a past that no longer exists." The weight of his words crushed me, and I felt a sob rise in my throat. I had lost her. I had lost my mom, the person who had raised me, who had loved me, and in her place was something else, something that looked like her, but wasn't her. The doctor moved past me, picking up his bag. "You should be with her when she wakes," he said softly. "She will need someone to guide her, to help her adjust. She is like a newborn now, learning the world anew." With that, he walked out of the room, leaving me alone in the dark. I heard the front door open and close, but I couldn't bring myself to move. I was too numb, too broken. After what felt like an eternity, I forced myself to stand and approach the bed. My mom, this new version of her, was still lying there, her eyes closed, her breathing steady. I reached out, my hand trembling, and gently touched her arm. Her eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, she just stared at the ceiling, her expression blank. Then, slowly, she turned to look at me. There was no recognition in her eyes, no spark of familiarity. She looked at me like I was a stranger. "Hello," she said, her voice soft, almost childlike. "Who are you?" My heart shattered into a million pieces, and I had to bite back a sob. I'm here to help you," I said, my voice trembling. "I'm here to take care of you." She smiled, a gentle, innocent smile that was so different from the one I remembered. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I feel safe with you." I nodded, tears blurring my vision. "You're safe," I whispered. "I promise, you're safe." She closed her eyes again, drifting back to sleep, and I sat there by the bed, my heart heavy with grief. I had wanted to save my mom, to bring her back from the brink, but in the end, I had lost her anyway. The person lying in that bed wasn't my mom. Not really. She was something new, something different, and I didn't know if I could ever love her the same way. But I had made a promise. I had brought this upon us, and now I had to live with it. I had to take care of her, even if she didn't remember me, even if she never would. The house was quiet now, the oppressive silence replaced by the soft sound of her breathing. The nightmare was over, but the horror of what I had done would haunt me for the rest of my life. And as I sat there in the darkness, holding the hand of the woman who used to be my mother, I knew one thing for certain. Some prices are too high to pay, no matter how desperate you are. The doctor was right. She would live. But at what cost? And as I stared at her peaceful, sleeping face, I wondered if there would ever come a day when I could forgive myself for the choice I had made. The end. I found ChatGPT on the dark web. The next night, 2 men in black suits knocked on my door. I've always had a fascination with the dark web, not because I'm some sort of thrill seeker, but more because I'm curious. You know, the way people are curious about haunted houses or old abandoned buildings. It's not that I ever planned to go too deep or do anything illegal. I just wanted to see what was out there. I mean, everyone's heard those crazy stories, right? People finding disturbing videos, mysterious chat rooms, or even strange marketplaces where you can buy just about anything. But for me, it was more about the mystery. I guess you could say I was looking for something to tell a good story about. Nothing more. So one night, I decided to finally take the plunge. I'd been reading up on how to safely browse the dark web for weeks. I downloaded Tor, set up a VPN, and made sure I was as secure as possible. After clicking around for a bit, I realized it wasn't as exciting as I'd imagined. Most of the stuff was either boring or just straight up sketchy. But then, just as I was about to call it a night, I found something that piqued my interest. It was a link hidden in one of those forms, a place that felt like it hadn't been updated since the early 2000s. The post was titled ChatGPT v2.3, Enhanced AI for the True Explorer. I clicked it, mostly out of curiosity, wondering what kind of AI they could be talking about. The thread itself was weirdly vague, filled with comments from anonymous users talking about how it knew too much, or how it shouldn't exist. Some even claimed it had predicted things about their lives that no AI should be able to know. Against my better judgment, I clicked the link at the bottom of the post. It led to a download page, plain and simple, with a single file called ChatGPT v2.3 zip. There was no description, no instructions, just a download button. I hesitated for a moment. This wasn't what I was looking for, but the mystery was too tempting to resist. I downloaded the file and extracted it to my desktop. Inside, there was only one executable file named ChatGPT _v2.3.exe. I double-clicked it, half expecting it to be some sort of virus or prank. But instead, a small black window popped up with a simple command line interface. It asked me to type my first question. "Hello?" I typed, unsure of what to expect. The response was almost immediate. "Hello, user. What would you like to know?" I felt a strange mix of relief and disappointment. This was just another chatbot, probably not even as advanced as the regular ChatGPT you could find online. But something about the way it responded felt different. It was almost too quick, too human. I started asking it random questions. "What's the weather like?" "Tell me a joke." "What's the capital of France?" The answers were all accurate, but that wasn't surprising. I decided to ask it something more personal, something it shouldn't be able to know. What did I have for dinner tonight? For a second, nothing happened. Then, the response appeared. You had spaghetti with marinara sauce, garlic bread, and a glass of red wine. I froze. There was no way it could have known that. I hadn't mentioned it online. I hadn't talked to anyone about it. I was alone. The only living being that could have known was my cat, and she wasn't much for conversation. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a lucky guess, or maybe I'd accidentally activated my microphone somehow. I shook it off and decided to push the boundaries a bit more. What was I wearing yesterday? Again, there was a brief pause before the screen filled with text. You wore a blue hoodie, black jeans, and white sneakers. You spilled coffee on your sleeve at 9:23 a.m. I stared at the screen, feeling a cold sweat forming on the back of my neck. This was beyond strange. It wasn't just describing what I was wearing. It was recounting a specific incident. One that, as far as I knew, was only witnessed by me. I should have stopped then. I should have closed the program and deleted the file, but my curiosity got the better of me. I kept asking it questions, each one more specific than the last, and every time, it answered with disturbing accuracy. What am I thinking right now? You're wondering how I know all of this. You're considering turning off your computer, but you're also too intrigued to stop. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized the AI was right. I was thinking exactly that. It felt like someone, or something, was watching me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in my own room. But then, the final response appeared on the screen, and it chilled me to the bone. Don't worry, user. You're not alone. They'll be there soon. I didn't have time to react before my screen went black, and my entire apartment was plunged into darkness. The power had gone out, and that's when I heard it. A knock on the door. I sat there frozen in my chair, my heart pounding in my ears. The knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. My mind raced with 100 different thoughts, none of them good. I glanced at the clock on my desk. It was just past midnight. No one should be at my door at this hour. No one I knew anyway. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to pretend I wasn't home. But I knew whoever was out there wouldn't just go away. Not after what I'd just experienced. I stood up, my legs shaky, and slowly made my way to the door. Every step felt like a mile, the air around me thick with an almost tangible sense of dread. I reached the door and pressed my eye to the peephole. At first, I didn't see anything, just darkness. But then, as my eyes adjusted, I saw them. 2 men, dressed in identical black suits, standing perfectly still on my porch. They were both tall, with sharp features and expressions that could have been carved out of stone. They didn't look like they belonged here, not in my quiet, suburban neighborhood. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Everything inside me screamed not to open it, but I couldn't just ignore them. What if they knew I was here? What if they knew I'd been talking to that AI? I took a deep breath and turned the knob, opening the door just a crack. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. One of the men. He had dark, slicked-back hair and eyes that seemed too cold, too calculating, spoke first. "Good evening. We're here to ask you a few questions. May we come in?" His voice was smooth, almost too polite, but there was an underlying edge to it that put me on high alert. I didn't know what they wanted, but I knew letting them inside would be a bad idea. I'm sorry, but it's really late, I said, forcing a small, nervous laugh. Can we do this some other time? The man's smile didn't reach his eyes. I'm afraid this is rather urgent. It's in your best interest to cooperate. My stomach dropped. There was something in the way he said best interest that made it clear this wasn't a request. I glanced back into my apartment, trying to think of a way out, but my mind was blank. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something that made my blood run cold. On the street behind the men, parked in the shadows, was a black car with tinted windows. It wasn't there before. I was sure of it. And now, I could just make out a figure sitting in the driver's seat watching. I needed to stall. Can you tell me what this is about? I asked, trying to keep the conversation going. I'm not sure how I can help you. The second man, who had been silent until now, stepped forward. He had pale skin and eyes that seemed to bore right through me. It's regarding your recent activities online, he said, his tone devoid of any emotion. We need to discuss what you've been accessing. A chill ran down my spine. They knew. Somehow. They knew what I'd been doing on the dark web. My thoughts raced back to the AI, to the final message it had sent before everything went dark. They'll be there soon. I tried to keep my composure, but my mind was spinning. I don't know what you're talking about, I stammered. I haven't done anything wrong. The man with the slicked back hair tilted his head slightly, as if studying me. Let's not make this difficult. We simply need to ask you a few questions about a certain program you recently interacted with. My heart was hammering in my chest. They weren't asking. They were telling. I knew I had to think fast, or I'd be in serious trouble. I'm sorry, I said, my voice shaking now. I really don't know what you mean. Maybe you've got the wrong person. The two men exchanged a glance, and I could feel the tension rising. The second man reached into his jacket, and for a terrifying moment, I thought he was going to pull out a weapon. Instead, he produced a small device, something that looked like a cross between a smartphone and a scanner. He held it up, and the screen flickered to life, displaying what looked like lines of code. We have reason to believe you've accessed a restricted AI, the man said, his eyes fixed on the device. This AI is not for public use, and its capabilities pose a significant threat, if not handled properly. My mind raced. How could they know so much? And why were they so concerned about a random program I found on the dark web? I'm sorry, I repeated, backing away from the door. I really don't know anything about that. The man with the device didn't even look up. He pressed a few buttons, and the screen flashed red. Then he finally met my eyes, his expression cold and unyielding. I'm afraid we can't leave until we've conducted a full investigation. If you won't cooperate willingly, we have other means of persuasion. My breath caught in my throat. I had to get away, but there was no way out. The door was the only exit, and they were blocking it. Then, almost as if reading my thoughts, the first man stepped forward, his hand reaching for the door. Please, he said, a note of finality in his voice. Let us in. I did the only thing I could think of. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands shaking. Almost immediately, the men began pounding on the door, their voices rising in anger. Open the door, they shouted. You're making a mistake. I backed away, my heart racing. I needed to call someone, anyone. But when I reached for my phone, the screen was dead. No signal, no power, nothing. The pounding grew louder, more frantic. The door rattled on its hinges as they tried to force their way in. I was out of options, out of time. The only thing I could do was run. I darted toward the back of my apartment, my mind racing for a plan. But before I could make it to the back door, I heard a loud crash from the front. They were inside. I didn't stop to think. I threw open the back door and ran into the night, the cold air biting at my skin. I could hear them behind me, their footsteps heavy and determined. They were chasing me, and they weren't far behind. I ran faster than I'd ever run in my life. My only goal to put as much distance between myself and those men as possible. I didn't know where I was going or how I was going to get away. But I knew one thing for sure. Whatever that AI was, I had stumbled onto something far more dangerous than I could have ever imagined. I ran blindly into the night, the cool air burning in my lungs as I pushed myself to move faster. My heart was pounding, each beat echoing in my ears like a drum. I didn't dare look back. I couldn't afford to lose any speed. The sound of footsteps crashing through the grass behind me was growing louder, more insistent, and I knew they were gaining on me. I hadn't planned for this. I never imagined that a simple curiosity would lead to two men in black suits breaking into my home and chasing me through the darkness. My mind was racing, filled with a mix of terror and confusion. I had no idea where I was going, but I knew I had to keep moving. As I tore through the neighborhood, I realized just how eerily quiet everything was. The streetlights flickered, casting long shadows across the empty roads. The houses I passed were dark, as if the entire world had gone to sleep and left me alone to face whatever nightmare I'd unleashed. There was no one around. No cars, no people, nothing. It was like I had slipped into some alternate reality, where I was the only one left. My feet pounded the pavement as I turned down a narrow alley, hoping to lose them in the maze of side streets and backyards. The walls closed in around me, the darkness pressing in from all sides. I could hear the men's voices now, low and urgent, as they followed my every move. They weren't shouting anymore. They didn't need to. They knew they were close. The alley twisted and turned, and I forced myself to keep going, even as my legs began to ache from the effort. I didn't know how long I could keep this up, but I wasn't about to stop and find out what they wanted from me. As I rounded a corner, I spotted a chain-link fence at the end of the alley. It was tall, with jagged metal spikes at the top, but I didn't have a choice. I sprinted toward it, my breath coming in ragged gasps, and threw myself at the fence. The metal bit into my hands as I climbed, each movement sending a sharp pain up my arms. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. Just as I reached the top, I heard one of the men shout, and I glanced back. They were at the entrance to the alley, their figures silhouetted against the dim light. The one with the device in his hand was pointing it at me, and even from this distance, I could see the screen glowing with that ominous red light. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I swung my legs over the fence and dropped to the other side, landing hard on the ground. Pain shot up my ankle as I hit the pavement, but I forced myself to stand. I hobbled forward, trying to ignore the throbbing in my foot, and limped toward the street. The neighborhood on this side of the fence was just as deserted as the one I'd left behind. Houses lined the street, dark and silent, their windows like empty eyes watching me as I stumbled past. I needed to find somewhere to hide, somewhere they wouldn't think to look. But with every passing second, my options were running out. I spotted an old, abandoned house at the end of the street, its windows boarded up and its front yard overgrown with weeds. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years, which made it perfect. I could hide there until they gave up, or at least until I could figure out what to do next. I limped toward the house, glancing over my shoulder every few steps. The men were nowhere in sight, but I knew they were still close. I reached the front door and hesitated for only a second before trying the handle. It was locked, of course, but the door was old, and the wood had rotted in places. With a few hard shoves, I managed to force it open, the hinges creaking in protest. I slipped inside and pulled the door shut behind me, plunging the room into darkness. My breath echoed in the stillness, and I strained to hear any sound from outside. For a moment, all was silent. But then, faintly, I heard the crunch of gravel underfoot. The men were getting closer. I turned and stumbled through the house, trying to find a place to hide. The interior was a mess. Furniture overturned, dust covering every surface, and the air thick with the smell of mildew. I moved as quickly as I could, every step sending a jolt of pain through my ankle. Finally, I found a small closet near the back of the house. I slipped inside and closed the door, sinking to the floor and pulling my knees to my chest. My hands were shaking, and I pressed them against my mouth to stifle my ragged breathing. I sat there in the dark, my heart racing as I listened for any sign of the men. The house was deathly quiet, the only sound the faint rustling of leaves outside. Minutes passed, each one dragging on like an eternity. And then I heard it, the front door creaking open. They were inside. I could hear their footsteps as they moved through the house, slow and deliberate. They were searching for me, methodically checking each room. I held my breath, praying they wouldn't find me. My mind raced with thoughts of what they might do if they did. The footsteps grew closer, echoing through the empty halls. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing myself to disappear, to become invisible in the darkness. My pulse thundered in my ears, drowning out all other sounds. I tried to focus on staying quiet, on not giving myself away. The footsteps stopped right outside the closet door. For a long, agonizing moment, there was nothing, just silence. Then slowly, the doorknob began to turn. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I was trapped. The door creaked open, and light spilled into the closet, blinding me. I braced myself for the worst, but as my eyes adjusted, I realized something was wrong. The closet wasn't empty. There, in the far corner, barely visible in the shadows, was a figure that hadn't been there when I first entered. It was a man, slumped against the wall, his clothes tattered and his skin pale as death. His eyes were open, staring blankly at the floor, and his mouth was twisted into a grotesque grin. But the worst part was his hands. His fingers were bent and twisted, the nails broken and bloodied, as if he'd clawed at the walls in desperation. My stomach turned, and I felt a wave of nausea rise up in my throat. I had to bite down hard to keep from making a sound. But then, as I stared at the figure, I realized something else. Something even more horrifying. The man was wearing the same clothes I was. Before I could process what I was seeing, the closet door was yanked open, and I was dragged into the light. The men had found me, their expressions cold and unfeeling as they pulled me to my feet. But I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure in the closet, from the twisted, broken version of myself lying there, dead. "This isn't supposed to happen," one of the men muttered, glancing at the other. "We need to reset it." The second man nodded, his grip tightening on my arm. "Agreed. Let's take him back." Panic surged through me, and I struggled against their hold, but it was no use. They were too strong, too determined. I was dragged out of the house and back into the night, my mind reeling from what I'd just seen. The last thing I remembered before everything went dark was the sound of that closet door creaking shut behind me, sealing away the horrifying truth I'd discovered. But as the darkness swallowed me, one thought kept repeating in my mind. Who or what had I just seen in that closet? When I woke up, I was lying on something cold and hard. My head throbbed, and my mouth was dry as sandpaper. I tried to move, but my limbs felt heavy, unresponsive, like they weren't quite my own. Slowly, I opened my eyes, and the world around me came into focus. I was in a small, dimly lit room, the kind that felt like it was designed to make you uncomfortable. The walls were made of bare concrete, and the only light came from a single flickering bulb hanging from the ceiling. There was a metallic tang in the air, something that smelled vaguely of blood and chemicals. Panic set in as I realized I had no idea where I was or how I'd gotten here. The last thing I remembered was being dragged out of that abandoned house, and then darkness. I tried to sit up, but my wrists were strapped down to the table I was lying on. The restraints weren't tight enough to hurt, but they were secure. Too secure to break free. I wasn't alone in the room. As my vision cleared, I saw the two men in black suits standing near a table covered with equipment. Computers, wires, strange devices I couldn't identify. They were talking in low voices, their backs to me. But I couldn't make out what they were saying. The sight of them sent a fresh wave of fear through me. But I forced myself to stay calm, to listen. After a moment, one of the men noticed I was awake. He turned, his expression unreadable, and walked over to me. The other man followed, carrying a tablet in his hand. "Good. You're awake," the first man said, his voice as cold and flat as ever. "We need to have a little chat." I tried to speak, but my throat was so dry that all I could manage was a hoarse croak. The man with the tablet seemed to notice, and without a word, he pulled a small water bottle from his jacket and handed it to me. I hesitated for a second, but I was too thirsty to care. I drank greedily, the water soothing my raw throat. "Where am I?" I finally managed to ask, my voice shaky. The man with the tablet ignored my question and began tapping on the screen. "We're going to ask you a few questions, and it's in your best interest to answer truthfully," he said, his eyes fixed on the tablet. "If you cooperate, this will be over soon. If not, well, things could get more complicated." My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. Why had they brought me here? What did they want? And what did they mean by reset? I thought back to the figure in the closet, that horrifying reflection of myself. The image sent a shiver down my spine. "What do you want from me?" I asked, my voice trembling. The man with the slicked back hair leaned in closer, his cold eyes boring into mine. "We want to know what you've seen," he said, each word measured and deliberate. "Tell us everything you experienced after interacting with the AI." I hesitated, trying to piece together what had happened. It all seemed so surreal, like a bad dream I couldn't wake up from. But I knew they wouldn't let me go until I told them something. I found the AI on the dark web," I began, my voice barely above a whisper. "It started answering questions, personal things it shouldn't have known. Then the power went out, and you showed up." The man nodded, as if he'd expected this. Go on. There was a message, I continued. My thoughts jumbled as I tried to remember the exact words. It said I wasn't alone, that someone was coming. The second man looked up from his tablet, his expression grim. And what did you see in the closet? He asked, his tone more insistent now. I hesitated, my stomach twisting at the memory. It was me, I said finally, my voice shaking. I saw myself, but I was dead, broken, like I'd been tortured. The two men exchanged a glance, and the one with the tablet started typing furiously. I couldn't tell if they were satisfied with my answer, or if they were planning something else, something worse. This is consistent with the anomaly, the man with the tablet muttered, almost to himself. We need to proceed with the reset. My heart skipped a beat. What do you mean, reset? I demanded, panic rising in my chest. What are you going to do to me? The man with the slicked back hair didn't answer. Instead, he stepped back and nodded to his partner, who tapped a few more times on the tablet before setting it down. Then, without warning, he pulled a small, sleek device from his pocket and pointed it at me. Before I could react, a blinding flash of light filled the room, and I felt a sharp pain at the base of my skull. It was as if someone had flipped a switch in my brain, turning everything off. I tried to scream, to struggle, but my body wouldn't respond. The light grew brighter, hotter, until it was all I could see, all I could feel. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the pain stopped. The light faded, and I was left in a numb, floating darkness. I don't know how long I was out. It could have been seconds, or it could have been hours. But when I finally opened my eyes, the room was gone. I was lying in my bed, in my own apartment, the familiar surroundings strangely comforting after everything I'd been through. For a moment, I wondered if it had all been a dream. Maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. The dark web, the AI, the men in black suits. But then I saw it. There, on my nightstand, was the tablet. The same one the man had been using, its screen dark and unresponsive. My heart raced as I reached for it, my fingers trembling. As soon as I touched the screen, it flickered to life, displaying a single line of text. Reset complete. All anomalies purged. I stared at the screen, my mind spinning. What had they done to me? What had they reset? And what did it mean by anomalies purged? Before I could process what was happening, the screen flickered again, and the text changed. Thank you for participating in the ChatGPT v2.3 experiment. Your cooperation has been noted. The screen went black, and no matter how many times I tried to turn it back on, it stayed that way. I threw the tablet across the room, my mind reeling from the implications. None of it made sense, and yet it felt all too real. I stumbled out of bed, my legs weak, and made my way to the bathroom. I needed to splash some water on my face to wake up from whatever nightmare I'd been thrust into. But as I looked at myself in the mirror, I froze. There, on the back of my neck, was a small, circular scar, like a burn mark. It was fresh, the skin around it red and irritated. I reached up to touch it, but the second my fingers brushed against it, a wave of nausea rolled over me, and I had to grip the sink to keep from collapsing. They'd done something to me, something I couldn't explain, something I couldn't undo. I didn't know what they wanted, or why they'd chosen me, but I knew one thing for certain. I'd stumbled onto something far more dangerous than I could ever have imagined, and now there was no going back. As I stared at my reflection, a cold dread settled in my chest, because deep down, I knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. I spent the next few days in a daze, constantly on edge, jumping at every little noise. The scar on the back of my neck throbbed with a dull ache, a constant reminder that what had happened was real. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that at any moment, those men would return to finish what they'd started. I couldn't focus on anything else, couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure in the closet, the twisted, broken version of myself. I couldn't help but wonder if that was what they had planned for me all along, if I'd somehow escaped a fate worse than death. But the scariest part? The world around me seemed different. It was subtle. Things most people wouldn't notice. A street sign that had always been green was now blue. A neighbor I'd known for years suddenly had a different last name. Even the taste of my favorite coffee had changed, just enough to be unsettling. It was like the world had been shifted ever so slightly out of sync with reality, and I was the only one who could tell. I tried to ignore it, to convince myself it was all in my head, but the anomalies were everywhere. The more I noticed, the more they piled up until it felt like I was living in a distorted mirror of my own life. But how could I explain it to anyone without sounding insane? I kept my mouth shut, but the fear gnawed at me from the inside, growing stronger with every passing day. Then, one night, just as I was starting to convince myself that maybe things would eventually go back to normal, I got a message. It wasn't on my phone or my computer. No, this one was far more personal. I was brushing my teeth, trying not to look too closely at the face in the mirror, when I heard a soft ding. I looked down at the sink, and there it was. A message, typed out neatly on the foggy bathroom mirror, as if someone had written it in the steam. "Are you ready to know the truth?" I froze, the toothbrush halfway to my mouth, my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't move. Slowly, as if in a trance, I reached out and wiped the fog from the mirror. The message was gone, but I knew what I'd seen. It was a question, one I didn't have the answer to. But even as fear gripped me, a part of me knew I couldn't ignore it. Whatever this was, whoever was behind it, they weren't done with me yet. And deep down, I knew I had to see it through, to find out what the hell was really going on. The next day, another message appeared, this time on my computer screen. It flashed up out of nowhere, the text filling the screen. Midnight. Alone. Come to the place where it all began. I didn't need any more details. I knew exactly where it meant. The abandoned house where they'd found me. The place where I'd seen whatever it was I'd seen in that closet. It was the last place I wanted to go, but I knew I didn't have a choice. That night, just before midnight, I made my way back to the house. The streets were empty, the air heavy with the scent of rain. I could feel the tension building inside me with every step, the dread creeping up my spine. But I had to know. I had to find out what they'd done to me, and why. The house loomed ahead, dark and foreboding. It looked exactly the same as before, abandoned, lifeless. But as I approached, I noticed something different. The front door was slightly ajar, a sliver of light spilling out onto the porch. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The house was exactly as I remembered it, the air thick with dust and decay. But there was something else now, something new. A faint hum, like the sound of machinery buried deep within the walls. I followed the sound, my footsteps echoing through the empty halls, until I reached the closet. The door was still closed, just as it had been when I left. My hand shook as I reached for the knob, my heart pounding in my ears. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But I couldn't. I had to know. I opened the door. Inside, the closet was dark, just as I remembered it. But there was no figure this time, no twisted version of myself waiting to haunt me. Instead, there was a small metallic box sitting on the floor, humming softly. It looked out of place, too modern for the decaying surroundings. I knelt down and picked it up, my hands trembling. The box was cool to the touch, vibrating slightly in my grip. There was a small screen on the front, glowing with a soft blue light. As I stared at it, words began to appear on the screen, one after another, forming a message. "Welcome back, user. You're almost ready. Almost ready. Ready for what?" My mind raced as I tried to make sense of it all. But before I could think too deeply, the screen flickered, and the message changed. "Would you like to restore your previous state?" The words hung there, taunting me. Previous state? Was this the reset they'd talked about? Had they somehow changed me, altered my reality, and now they were offering to undo it? Or was this just another trap, another way to control me? I didn't have the answers, but I knew one thing. I couldn't go back to living in this twisted version of my life, where nothing made sense, and every day was a waking nightmare. I had to take the chance, no matter the risk. My finger hovered over the small button below the screen. All I had to do was press it, and whatever this was, it would begin. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. Then, with a mix of fear and determination, I pressed the button. The box began to hum louder, the vibration intensifying. The light on the screen grew brighter, and I had to squint to see what was happening. The words on the screen blurred, replaced by a single line of text that burned itself into my mind. Resetting. Please remain still. Suddenly, I felt a sharp pain at the back of my neck, right where the scar was. It spread through my body like wildfire, every nerve screaming in agony. I tried to move, to scream, but I was frozen in place, trapped in a vice of pain and fear. The room around me began to warp, the walls bending and twisting like they were made of liquid. The floor dropped out from under me, and I was falling, tumbling through a void of light and sound, my mind unraveling with each passing second. Then, just as quickly as it had begun, it stopped. I was standing in the middle of my apartment, the morning sun streaming through the windows. The world was still, calm, normal. I was back, but something was wrong. I could feel it, deep in my bones, like an itch I couldn't scratch. I rushed to the bathroom, my heart pounding, and stared at myself in the mirror. The scar on the back of my neck was gone, the skin smooth and unblemished. But as I looked closer, I noticed something else, something that made my blood run cold. My reflection was smiling. I wasn't. I stepped back, horror flooding my veins, but the reflection didn't move. It just stood there, grinning at me, its eyes filled with a cold, malevolent intelligence. And then, without warning, it spoke, its voice a twisted version of my own. "Welcome to your new reality, user. You're finally ready." I stumbled backward, my mind reeling, but the reflection didn't stop. It leaned closer, its smile widening, as it whispered the final words that would haunt me forever. "This time, You won't be alone. And then, with a flash of light, the mirror shattered, the shards scattering across the floor like pieces of a broken dream. But it didn't matter. The damage was done. I was trapped, caught in a nightmare of my own making, with no way out. Because now, no matter where I went, no matter how hard I tried to escape, I knew the truth. I wasn't the same person I used to be, and I never would be again.